Foundation for Economic Growth webinar series, which we have started about 3 years ago. We have been very fortunate to have a very good blend of policymakers and also academicians speaking to us from across the world. When we started the series, we were very keen to have a blend of speakers from outside the world, from outside India, rest of the world, and India, and we have been very successful in finding that blend. I am also very excited to share with you that we have had 2 Nobel laureates speak to us. And according to my own calculations, I think a few of the speakers that we had are potential Nobel laureates. So we feel very proud of the fact that this webinar series has contributed significantly into policy making, thinking about contemporary issues which are relevant to India and also which are important for the world. We were then also very fortunate to run 11 webinars for the G20 under Task Force 5. So to that extent, this webinar series is contributing significantly in public policy and debate on public policy issues in our country. In continuation of the same series, we wanted Professor Galina to come and participate in the discussion on climate when we were doing the Task Force 5 under G20, but Professor Galina was very busy at that time, and that is when we thought we will do a separate session exclusively for her taking up these issues. Professor Galina, as Professor Nagesh will introduce her later, has worked extensively on external sector, and she has contributed significantly in literature on the external sector. So let me introduce Professor Nagesh and then hand over the session to him to take the proceedings further. Professor Nagesh is a dear friend of mine and is the director of the Institute for Studies in Industrial Development in Delhi. It's a Delhi-based policy think tank of the Indian Council of Social Science Research devoted to fostering India's industrial transformation. So you can imagine when we talk about Make in India, Professor Nagesh fits in that big scheme of things. Prior to taking up this role in May 2021, Professor Kumar served as director at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, UNSCAP, holding several senior management positions during 2009 to 2021 when he was there, including as chief economist, director of macroeconomic policy and financing for development division and social development division at the UNSCAP headquarters in Bangkok, and as head of the South and Southwest Asia office located in New Delhi that he also had the privilege of establishing. Professor Kumar has been nominated as the non-resident senior fellow by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, Boston, Massachusetts. During 2002 to 2009, Professor Kumar served, and this is very important, where he left a mark on the Indian policy making. Professor Kumar served as the Director General of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS, a policy think tank of the Government of India, of which he was Deputy Director General 1998 to 2002, and a fellow during 1985 to 1993. Professor Kumar has served as an economist at different places, but most importantly at United Nations University in Maastricht, the Netherlands. He has a very long profile, and just to save time, I would say that Professor Kumar has been contributing significantly in academic literature and policy making, and he is generally a colleague with me when we are invited for policy discussions at important government fora. It's always a privilege to listen to Professor Kumar and his ideas. With this, I hand over the session to Professor Kumar to conduct the proceedings further.
Thank you, Dr. Charan Singh. I hope I am audible. So thank you, Dr. Chan Singh, for giving me this opportunity at this very interesting session organized by EGROW Foundation. And I was very impressed with the profile of our speaker today. You mentioned about a little bit about her, Galina Hale, at the University of California, Santa Cruz. But she has been at many places, University of California, Berkeley, Stanford, and Yale, and also at the she has been a research advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. So, and widely published in top rated journals. So if I start reading all the names of the journals, you would know that this is the top tier journals of economics, especially on finance. And she is a director of the Xebra's IFM program. I presume it is International Finance Program, and the co-director of the University of California, Santa Cruz Center for Analytical Finance, CAFIN. She serves on multiple boards and committees in the animal welfare and animal agricultural space, which is her kind of other passion besides economics and finance research of the very cutting edge. Now, she has written a very important paper on climate risks and FDI, which is what she's going to share with us today. Uh, I don't need to emphasize how important climate risks have become for every country in the world. In India, we are facing these extreme weather events, and frequency of these extreme weather events is rising all the time. And so, just before we started, Charan was talking about how May is not a usual May of Delhi, and it is having a lot of rains and wind and all that, storms, and not the very, sort of hot summer. And so sometimes it becomes very hot summer, sometimes it is opposite of that. So these extreme weather events are the fact of life. But there is also climate change related policy making, which is evolving. And so, how do these, uh, extreme weather events and climate related policy making affect business decisions, in particular FDI decisions? So, there hasn't been much work on this up to now, except for this pollution heaven hypothesis testing, on which there has been some work. But so that way, I think what Galina is going to present to us is a very pioneering exercise. And I was very impressed with the way it has been handled. She has developed a theoretical framework and then goes on to test it at different levels. So lot of theoretical work followed by a lot of very good, very robust empirical work. So this will be very interesting, and I'm sure it would be very widely read and followed up paper in future. So with that, I would like to invite her to present her paper, and then there will be a discussant, uh, Professor Suma Athreye, who has recently joined Indian Institute of Technology, the School of Public Policy at the Indian Institute of Technology, which is also a very important institution in the country. Uh, but she has been a professor of technology management at Essex Business School for many years, and she is also a visiting professor at ISID, where so she has been a colleague, but only now and then, not full time here. So we have the benefit of her presence in many of our studies and research. With that, I want to really hand over to Galina and to invite her to present her paper. Then we will have a discussion by Suma and we will open it up to rest of you. So over to you, Galina.
Thank you so much, Professor Kumar, for the introduction, and thank you, Dr. Singh, for inviting me to speak. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be talking to the distinguished audience you have. So before I start presenting the paper, I also want to mention, following up on what Professor Kumar said about growing physical risks, and I think in India, of all countries, it's very visible to everybody. And what I've been, I don't have anything to show for it, but what I've been working over the last couple of years also is trying to figure out how to encourage private sector to invest more in adaptation solutions. Because, we have carbon markets, there is a way for firms to invest in mitigation, but it's much harder with the adaptation solutions, and they're becoming more and more important because the climate change is here. And, in California, where I live, we have fires and floods. In Santa Cruz, we had 2 floods in the Santa Cruz County since January, and they were quite devastating. They were not of the scale that, you experience in subcontinent, but for our local economy, it was quite notable. Even President Biden came to Santa Cruz in the aftermath of one of those floods. So it was of a national proportion. So adaptation is becoming more and more important because we didn't do enough in the last 30 years. Anyway, so I'm going to share my slides. If I do it right. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Yes, okay, great. So this paper is co-authored with Grace Gu, who is my colleague in Santa Cruz. And the question we asked was, as the climate risks are increasing, both the physical risk that Professor Kumar was talking about, and also the implementation risk, or think about that transition risk, that has to do with different policies that are being adopted, most notably in Europe, to abate greenhouse gas emissions. Do the firms and do the multinational firms react to that, right? And so the reason we think it's very important is because as the recognition of these climate risks is growing and the risks themselves become more important, if the firms are not reacting continuously or in real time, there is a risk that, one day everybody is going to wake up and say, wait a second, we should move out of those countries that have either very strict greenhouse gas policies or very high physical risk. So if, in a sense, we are worried about finding no effects, because no effects would mean that in the future, there is going to be potentially a very rapid reallocation of businesses across the world, as there are a number of papers now that show how industrial location across the world will have to change with the sea level rising and temperatures increasing in a lot of areas that are already hot. So we were kind of actually hoping to find some effects, because that would mean that there is a continuous reaction to climate risks and there is no pent-up change that might realize at one point. So it's very hard to measure the effects of climate risks, partly because those risks have increased non-linearly in recent years. And so the future is not necessarily going to look like the past. And so that creates a little bit of a disconnect about, the policy conclusions we want to make and the empirical results we get necessarily from the data that we have observed in the past. And also, we don't have a necessarily good framework to know what is that we expect from the data. So to kind of mitigate some of these problems, obviously not solve these problems, we do build a partial equilibrium model So we at least get some intuition on some potential complexities of the relationship between climate risks and multinational location decisions. It's a very simple model. It doesn't include all the consumption effects and things like that. We just look at the multinational mergers and acquisitions, essentially, decisions. And then because, and I can preview the results, we find mostly no effect. We have to conduct very extensive empirical work, because if you're saying there is no effect, you have to show that you've looked everywhere, right? So what we do is try to be very comprehensive. So we conduct our empirical analysis at the country level, at the bilateral country pair level, at the country industry level, and also at firm level. And at each level of aggregation, we are able to use different levels of fixed effects. So identification comes from different variation. And we also find from the model predictions that emission productivity, which we define as output or value added per unit of emissions, is an important determinant of what effects you should expect. So we also interact the climate risks with emission productivity to see how the results change. And also at the firm level, we use a measure of climate risk exposure or climate risk awareness that I'm going to discuss in a little bit more detail, to see if some firms that are paying more attention to climate risk are reacting more than other firms that do not really think about that yet. So that is one aspect in which we can say, okay, as more firms become more aware of climate risks, we expect them, excuse me, to behave more like the firms that are already paying attention to climate risks. So that helps us with, interpreting our results for policy implications. There is not much research on the topic, but there is some. And most of the papers are, either at the country level or, they're mostly at the country level. The Kato and Akubo paper is looking at the input-output linkages, and Nora Pankratz and Schiller paper is actually looking at the firm level, but they're mostly looking at global supply chains. So it's not so much FDI as more trade linkages, although some of those linkages include firm affiliates, but they do not distinguish between trade and FDI. So what we do differently is we really look at the different aggregation levels, and we use interactions, and we provide a model that gives intuition. So what the model predicts is pretty clear, that the target countries, so the country in which the firms purchase their affiliates, the physical risk and transition risk directly reduce FDI inflows and the number of multinational firm affiliates. So we can look at the extensive and intensive margin in a model. And emission productivity increases. So higher emission productivity means less emissions per output, right? Excuse me. So higher emission productivity increases FDI. However, emission productivity can either dampen or amplify the impact of climate risks. And that's one of the theoretical insights that's important, because when conducting empirical work, it's actually very hard to get the data on emission productivity. So we do that at the industry level using World Input-Output Database environmental accounts. And I'm now working on another paper with colleagues at the European Central Bank that have access to the firm level emission productivity data, because it really matters. The model really says the results could go up or down depending on what emission productivity is. And so it's important to include that. And it could be one explanation for why, when you have no control for emission productivity, you find zero results, because for some firms, the effects are positive, for some negative, you average it out, you get a zero. So that's one of the learnings from this paper, is that it's really important to know the emissions. And in most countries, we don't collect this data for the firms. So if you have any influence on policy making, the Security Exchange Commission in the US has a proposal for climate risk disclosure that is still sitting as a proposal because they didn't get it pushed through on time through the Congress. So I don't know when, if at all, it's going to be implemented. It's very good policy. It's based on TCFD framework. And I think if all the countries in the world adopt this disclosure policy, at least for the publicly traded firms, it's going to be very important for policymaking decisions as well as for research. Okay. So what do we find? We find that there is no consistent evidence for a statistically significant effect for either physical or transition risks on the M&E locations. But we do find that when, after the Paris Accord, so 2016, the firms that are more exposed or more aware of climate risks, they do react more than other firms. There is a significant effect there. Also, we find that countries that have higher emission productivity are less likely to experience FDI outflows after extreme weather events. So at the country industry level, where we have information on emission productivity, we do find some effects. So let me walk you through the model. I'm not going to give you all the details and all the equations because we don't have all night. I'll just give you an outline and some pictures. So the question we ask is how many affiliates a multinational would locate and how much FDI flow this would correspond to in a target country, and how the above measures change with physical and transition risk, and what's the interaction effect with emission productivity. We use a very simple partial equilibrium two-country model. And we're thinking about horizontal FDI, not vertical FDI. So there's no goods trade, there is no intermediate goods. If you want to reinterpret the model as vertical FDI, you just need to change the elasticity parameter, the substitution elasticity parameter, and you can actually reinterpret it as a vertical FDI model. But just for simplicity, we keep it the Helpman-Mellet-Yipple setup. There is one multinational, and there are other firms, there are N of them, and there could be either domestic firms or foreign affiliates. And a multinational buys affiliates in the foreign country at a bargain price from the local owners, and that allows us to calculate FDI inflow. So we multiply the price of price of affiliate you buy times the number of affiliates to get this intense margin. So the price is endogenous. Each affiliate and local firm produces one variety, so we have monopolistic competition in the production market and the CES utility function. And as I was saying, in the CES, if you change the substitution elasticity, you can get a vertical FDI interpretation of the model. In terms of timing, multinational decides to purchase an affiliate or not before the realization of the disaster state. And in the main model, we have transition risk measured as just a constant parameter, but you can replace it with the expectation of the policies. So you can make it a random variable. It's actually not going to change any predictions. So what does the model deliver? As I said, when a target country physical climate risk increases, that increases affiliates' expected overhead cost because the physical risk increases, the capital costs, if you will. You need to restore some of your destroyed equipment. Or if the disaster actually happens, so it's either an expectation or a realization of disaster, that would reduce the number of affiliates in the target country. And this is something that you should expect because it's kind of an obvious result. With transition risk, when climate policies increase the emission unit cost, so think of that as a carbon tax, and the emission is an input in production, then the number of affiliates is going to decrease. And the policies would actually also dampen the effect of physical risk from the first proposition. So this is also kind of obvious. You make it more costly to produce in your country, fewer firms are going to choose to locate their production there. When technology becomes greener, right, so emission productivity increases, and I'm going to show you some pictures of how we think the distribution looks like. The number of affiliates in the country increases, but the emission productivity can either amplify or dampen the effects of the physical and transition risks. And this proposition for the FDI flows, so the intensive margins are very similar, so I'm not going to go through them separately. So let me give you 3 cases. So the Pareto distribution is the distribution of emission productivity. It has this shape because below certain productivity, the firms just don't produce, right? And this is the first case where the blue line would be the productivity of local firms, and the orange line would be the productivity of multinationals affiliates. And so we are assuming here that multinational are more picky in terms of how productive their affiliates have to be in terms of their emissions. So these are the distribution of productivity for the 2 sets of firms. Or you can also think about the 2 cases where the multinational is less picky, so the blue line, or more picky, like an orange line, right? And then the movement from the gray to a green vertical line is the change in the climate risk, either physical or transition risk. You can think about either, so it's going to be represented in the same way. And what it shows you is if there is this change in transition or physical risks, the mass of the firms for the higher productivity distribution, right, which we call better, that has to exit the market because that becomes a threshold. So the vertical line is a threshold given the risks at which the multinational enters. With the higher productivity distribution, that's orange, a bigger mass of firms is going to exit compared to the blue productivity distribution. So that's why we call this case better loses. If you have a better productivity, you actually lose more FDI if there is a change in the physical or transition risk. That's one case. There could be a different case, right? I could draw this gray and green lines to the left of the cutoff for an orange distribution. In that case, there is no effect on the higher productivity distribution firms, but there is an effect on the lower productivity distribution. So we call this case better wins because what we would observe in this case is for the lower emission productivity distribution, there is an exit as a result of physical or transition risks, but there is no effect on higher emission productivity. There could be also a case that this threshold, the climate risks and physical risks are so low that this threshold is actually to the left of both of the cutoffs. So there would be no effect on either. Okay, so one way to think about that, as climate risks increase, we would expect both of these lines, gray and green line, to move to the right. So the cutoff is going to be higher and higher. And so initially, if we observe no effects today, we should be expecting first the low productivity firms to be more sensitive to the climate risks. And then we would expect high productivity firms to be more sensitive to the climate risks as climate risks increase. Okay, so to summarize, physical risk or transition risk increase or actual disaster realizes, that leads to the reduction in FDI. That's what the model predicts. Transition risk may dampen the negative effect of physical risk, and emission productivity can amplify or dampen the impact of these risks on FDI, depending on where these cutoffs are. And what we also kind of assert based on the model is, given that on average, emission productivity is higher in advanced economies than in emerging economies, we would expect amplification to be more likely empirically. So it's the proposition better loses. So we're going to find that higher emission productivity is actually associated with more effect of climate risks on FDI. Okay, so what do we do empirically? And I promise I will show you some tables and pictures. But I just want to show you. So we have information on FDI either at target country level, I, or country pair, IJ, where J is the source country. So for these regressions, we can include target country fixed effects, time fixed effects. We also include country group times time fixed effect, where the country group's advanced emergence or low income country. And we can also include source time and target time fixed effects when we run a country pair regression. We also put an interaction with post-Paris, post-COP21. So from 2016 on is an indicator, it takes on value of 1. And we interact variables of interest with that. We also do essentially a cross-sectional analysis by taking a difference between post-COP21 and pre-COP21 averages across time, so that we can just ignore, short-term fluctuations and just focus on longer-term changes. Okay, and we can do that at the country level, and we do it at the country pair level. We use both OLS and what is that called? I forget. Silvana Tenreiro's approach to bilateral regressions, where there are a lot of zeros. We also have data at country industry level. So there is no source country information, but there is a target country and industry information. And so for this case, we can put a country industry, country time fixed effects, and the identification comes from within country industry level, right? So within given country industry, FDI changes over time, and that's where the identification comes from. Finally, at the firm level, we have information on the headquarter country and on the affiliate country. And we can run a regression at the firm level, where we control for the firm fixed effects, target country fixed effect, and the target country industry fixed effect, as well as the time fixed effect. So the identification comes from within firm country target, firm target country. So for a given firm, if there is a change in physical or transition risk in some target country, how do they change the number of affiliates they have in that country? Okay. So the data I'm going to go through very quickly. We use very traditional source of the data for physical risk is emergency event database that goes back to 1900s, has extreme weather events. It's imperfect, but it's the best there is. It's much better if you look after 1990, and that's roughly where our data starts for most of our analysis. And we don't look at all disasters. We only look at the climate-related disasters, which are climatological, which is mostly wildfire or drought, meteorological, which is extreme temperatures and storms, and hydrologicals, which is floods. There are other ones, but these are the dominant ones. The data comes in monthly frequency with a number of events, deaths, number of people affected, and economic losses. And we aggregate the data to the country year level. For transition risk, we use a lot of sources. We've tried all kinds of things. In the end, we use International Energy Agency energy policies data. We also use environmental protection stringency data from OECD. We also have CO2 tax from the same source as EPS. And we also use Notre Dame and EGAIN Climate Vulnerability Index that combines physical and transition risks. For emission data, as I mentioned, we get World Input-Output Database, environmental accounts. And we measure emission as emission-relevant energy use minus emission-relevant energy use from nuclear and renewables. So it's just the fossil fuel emission energy. So only essentially scope 2 emissions only, that's the data we have. And we measure country industry and emission productivity by dividing real value added of that country industry in that year by the emissions in country industry in that year. And then we also aggregate this to country level since we have the data. For one more data source, so the climate risk exposure or awareness data comes from a paper by Sontner et al. They basically did a textual analysis of the firm conference earning calls and measured how much climate and risk are mentioned next to each other. And it's a data set they share with ISIN numbers. So if you're working with a firm level data, it's really an important contribution. So what it shows actually is that after Paris, the number of firms, or the average attention to the climate risk started to increase quite rapidly. And that's what we also find, and it's very consistent with the literature. Whoever finds the effects of climate risks on anything financial, those effects are generally only found after 2016. So it's quite consistent with the bigger picture. For FDI, country level comes from World Development Indicators, bilateral comes from CDIS by the IMF, country industry comes from OECD, and it took some work matching the industries in ISEC 4 to the WIOD. If anybody is doing this work, get in touch. I have a code I'm happy to share. And for extensive margins at the aggregate level, we just put a 0-1 on whether inflow is positive or negative. Yep. Hello? Okay. For the firm level, we use Orbis data. So it's on, because there are 3 million firms, we're trying to make it usable. So we restrict to the firms that have total corporate assets over $1 billion in a given year. And then we exclude offshore centers as target countries, but we do keep firms that have headquarters in offshore centers. And for each firm, we collect information on how many affiliates they have in each individual country, except for the offshore center. Then the intensive margin would be measured as the number of affiliates in a given country divided by the total number of affiliates the firm has. An extensive margin would be a dummy of whether the firm has more or fewer affiliates. So whether they opened new affiliates in a given country or whether they closed existing affiliates in a given country. So that would be our measure of inflow and outflow. Unfortunately, we don't have enough information on the value of those affiliates, so we have to just do the counts. I'm going to skip the details. Okay, so what do we find? So because we've run, 2,000 regressions, I'm not going to show you. I'm hearing. Okay.
Sorry, I think Mr. Praveen Kumar, let her finish her presentation. We will open up for discussion, and there you can come in. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. So I'm just going to give you some summaries of the significance and signs of the results. And in the paper, we also have heat maps for the magnitudes. And I'm just going to show you a couple of graphs. And I'm going to show one regression table on the firm level exposure with the interaction for the climate change risk at the firm level. So to summarize what we find, in general, there is little consistent and significant evidence for the impact of climate risks on FDI, but we do find something, right? So we find that at aggregate level, there is no significant increase in response to climate risks after Paris Accord. So, and it's kind of consistent with what other papers find. So if you just look at the aggregate levels, you pretty much find nothing. At the firm level, we do find that firms with high climate risk exposure are more likely to reduce FDI in response to target countries' physical risks following Paris Climate Accord. So that kind of makes us think, well, as more firms wake up to these climate risks, we should probably see more of this movement. At the country industry level, which is most reliable in terms of emission productivity because we don't have to aggregate. The emission productivity leads to higher FDI inflows at both intensive and extensive margin. But we also find the evidence for the better losers. So in fact, there is more negative effects of FDI in the countries with lower emission productivity. With higher emission productivity. But at the country and industry and firm level, we find the opposite, okay? And so we think there is some of the results we find with emission interactions, especially when we aggregate up to country level, has to do with the composition effects, because across industries, the production functions are different. Some firms need more energy than others. And so we believe it's really important to get down to the firm level and emissions to really figure out the direction of the effects. So this is just a summary of some of the results for the intensive margin. So what I'm showing you is just a count of significantly positive and significantly negative coefficients. So these are first two numbers. And the third number is the total number of specifications for that cell. So for example, here, effect on intensive margin of FDI in a target from the, say, climatological effect in a target country. The model predicts the effect to be negative. We run for that specification for all countries in the sample, 28 specifications at different level of aggregation and different setups. Out of 28 specifications, in 3, we find positive effects on FDI, so the opposite from the model predicts. In 8, we find negative effects, so consistent with what the model predicts. But in all the rest, the effect is not significant. Okay, so highlighted in red are the results that are consistently at odds with what the model predicts. So here we find, and this is what I was telling you about, the composition effects. We would expect with higher emission productivity, there is more FDI, but we never find that. We find sometimes significantly that there is actually less FDI, but these 4 cases come from the country level regressions where we're aggregating, you know, service industries with manufacturing industries. So there might be some composition effects there. But overall, since nothing is green and not much is red, it basically tells you on average, we do not find consistent significant effects for the intensive margin. It's a little bit more interesting for the extensive margin. We consistently find that FDI inflows decrease when there is a climatological event, so drought, for example, or wildfire. And that is mostly driven by the advanced economies. We also find the outflow from emerging economies when there is flood. And we also find outflow from advanced economies when there is an increase in transition risk. So there is a policy change such as carbon tax. So these are pretty robust, but the rest is still kind of zero. Because of the model ambiguous predictions on interactions with emission productivity, I'm only highlighting some results in blue because they could be, either could be consistent. What we find is the effects of climatological and meteorological effects are opposite, and this is consistent with the literature. A lot of people find that meteorological effect and climatological effects have different signs, and there's not much explanation in the literature for why it's the case. But we also find more outflows in response to meteorological effects, mostly from advanced economies, and also in terms of hydrological effects, we see more outflows. Okay. Otherwise, whatever is not in color just tells you it's mostly insignificant, or there is roughly same number of positive as negative effects, so the effect is not robust. In terms of the magnitudes, this is just an example that we take the regressions at the country industry level. So we're setting all the effects of controls and fixed effects to 0. And the blue/green plane shows you the effects of emission productivity and transition risk on FDI inflows in a situation where there is no disaster. And the red and orange surface shows you the same when there is one climatological disaster of mean severity. Okay, so what you can see is that in terms of magnitudes, if forget about significance, for advanced economies, physical disasters do not have almost any effect on FDI. The two planes are right on top of each other. Whereas for emerging economies, not surprisingly, there is a much bigger effect of physical risks. And our explanation for this, that even if you set severity at the mean, the physical risks are much more important for emerging economies. And in this set of country industry data, we don't have low-income countries at all. We also find, though, that higher emission productivity increases FDI inflows, and more so when there is a transition risk. So that is consistent with our model prediction. And we find a different situation for the emerging economies. There is higher emission productivity increases FDI flows, but when you have transition risks, it actually decreases them. So that's one way to kind of look at the relative magnitudes of different effects of all these controls and interactions. Okay, so a final set of evidence I'm going to show is at the firm level. So this is just a regression table. We have all kinds of controls, and we have firm target country, firm year, target industry, target country year, and target industry fixed effects. And we're estimating the effects on intensive margin. So it's how many affiliates the firm has as a share of total number of affiliates that firm has. For a full sample, for advanced economies, emerging economies, and for the firms with headquarters in offshore financial centers. So the targets are advanced or emerging, or source is in OFC. And we're interacting, so we have four physical risk variables, what kind of risk it is, climatological, meteorological, hydrological, the severity of the disaster, and we also have a measure of policy from IEA in this case. And we interact those variables with a dummy of post-COP21. So what we find is that and all of this is, I'm showing you the triple interaction, in fact, with the climate risk exposure of the firm, right? So I'm not showing you any of the main effects. All of them are actually absorbed by the fixed effects. So it's an interaction of climate change risk with meteorological or with physical transition risk times post COP21. So what you find is that for the firms that are more exposed to climate risks or more attentive to climate risks because they talk about it more, after COP21, there is a significant negative effect for, they're reducing the number of affiliates in the affected countries following climatological effects and meteorological effects in advanced economies. What we also find is that there is also some positive effects. So the firms that are attentive to climate risks, they actually increase the FDI in the countries that adopt some kind of emission abatement policies. Okay. So there is something there. We need more years to pass by to measure it more precisely. There are a lot of robustness tests. We do test for endogeneity concerns, for actual reverse causality or spillovers. We use alternative policy measures. We try additional controls, exchange rates, credit ratings, anything that you think might affect FDI. We've tried to include it. It didn't really affect the results. And truth to be told, with results mostly being non-significant, it's not that hard for them to be robust. So what do we think is going on? So first explanation could be we didn't look in the right place, but we kind of looked everywhere we could, and nobody suggested that there is something we missed in our empirical search. So we can cross that out. So another option is the firms are not paying enough attention to the climate risks, and so they do not react in the way we would expect them to, given the theory. And that's one possibility, and we do have some evidence that the firms that do pay attention react more, so there is possibly some of that is going on, and that is a risk for, potential movement of production across the world in the future. The model also predicts that if you green the technology over time, so emission productivity increases over time, like all productivities increase over time, it actually will reduce response to climate shocks. And in fact, we find that emission productivity is trending up, but we also test whether it's a result of climate policies, and it is not. It's just a secular trend. So this does not give us any endogeneity, and emission productivity is not high enough to completely cancel the effects of climate shocks. So what do we conclude from this? Our main questions: do multinationals incorporate climate risks into their FDI decision? And mostly is not yet. And our contribution is, there's not so many papers that look at both climate risks, the physical and transitional risk. We do look very comprehensively at different level of aggregation, and our specifications are guided by the model predictions. So we do have a model that kind of provides intuition for what is that we should test. Our main takeaway is that because attention of multinationals to climate risk is likely to be rising, as we saw from this chart I showed you on the climate risk, and because more exposed firms react more, in the future, we can have large and abrupt changes in FDI and when climate risks intensify. Also, as I said, we need a future research to account for emission productivity, ideally at the firm level. And I presented this paper last summer at the CIBRA conference in Barcelona, and in the audience, Sante Carbone, who used to be at the ECB, is now teaching at the university. He said, hey, let's talk. And so now we're working on the paper on this. So I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much, Galina. I think it's a mind-boggling kind of exercise you have done. So many variables, so many levels, and so to comprehend all this, by itself would be a challenge. But you have done that very well, I must say, in 50 minutes. And so a lot of sort of theoretical framework to sort of test the incidents or effects of climate change, both extreme events and policy making on the business decisions of multinational companies. And as you find that as of now, there is not much there, but beginning to happen. And what is very interesting is that there is a divergence of research between advanced economies and emerging market economies. That is something which should be taken note of by researchers in the coming years. So with that, let me open it up, but first to our discussant, Professor Suma Athreye, and then to the rest of the audience. So Suma, you have the floor.
Thanks, Nagesh, and thank you, Galina. It's really a tour de force, like when I started reading the paper last night, I guess that you have worked for a very long time on these results. So thank you very much for sharing it with us. I understood a little bit more from your presentation. And overall, my sort of first thought was, wow, this is really interesting. Nobody has really gone this far into thinking about how is it that climate change and the risks of climate change will affect international investments. I should say that I look at this paper also with my background as a scholar of international business, where we look at multinational decisions. That's been part of my academic history. So I'm going to use both those lenses. And I can't say that these are just thoughts that I had about your paper. And please forgive me if I misunderstood something, but I'm going to rephrase it in my terms a little bit in these comments. So the way I looked at it was that this is a sort of novelty on versions of location theory of multinationals where, usually a role is played by transport costs in different ways. But instead of, I didn't understand quite if it was instead of transport cost or in addition to transport costs. You have augmented those models somehow with emission costs and risks of extreme events. I don't know if that's a fair way to put it, but that's where I started from. And I said, okay, this is actually in this class of arguments. And the novelty here is that we are replacing or augmenting one sort of costs with other sorts. And then the first question in my mind is, are they really comparable in this way? I mean, could we, so something like transport costs, you feel the incidence as soon as, it happens. I mean, whenever you physically move goods and services. But could we say the same about extreme events? Could we say the same about emission costs or productivity, depending on how you look at it? Because the way I started thinking about it is that there are actually at least two, if not three dimensions of difference. First is the time horizon over which you feel these costs. The effect of a disaster may or may not be immediate depending upon where the disaster happened vis-a-vis the location of the firm. And so there is some kind of, you're waiting, I suppose in a theoretical model, you're waiting for the effects from that location to permeate to where the headquarters is or where some of the plants are in order to feel the costs of that kind of physical disaster. Similarly, about the emissions, I just wondered whether emissions cost does actually capture the cost to the MNE. And towards the end of your presentation, I understood that this is an industry level measure rather than a firm level measure, because one of the problems with emissions, of course, is that like we recognize this in Delhi very well, that somebody burns some crop, in Haryana, and the wind just kind of carries the smoke and the pollutants to Delhi. And so the person who's actually polluting is very far away from where the effect of the pollution is felt. So there were these kind of thoughts that, I thought made the model perhaps more complicated than how it is presented. And I just wish to hear what you think of it. Is this a good way of looking at the location of affiliates? Can I compare it to an earlier class of mostly Hoytelling kind of models and say, okay, what has been the improvement and in what dimension, and does that help us? So it's just me as someone who has studied these things, trying to make sense of a new piece of theory that has come my way. And it may or may not be related, but I thought it could be quite an interesting thing to hear your thoughts about. The second set of the second thing, just even theoretically to think about the two types of risks that you present in the paper, is that they are so different. The extreme event risk is a kind of episodic event, right? I mean, it happens, it may happen with more frequency, it may shift a trend. I don't know. I mean, there's many ways of thinking about how you would model it, but it is kind of different from the emission costs. So there are very different types of events. And I was interested to see when you were presenting that you have, disaster only, emissions only. I don't know if you put up the results or I understood the results at that level of detail, but I think that could be quite interesting to understand what does a shock do compared to something that's steadily improving over time. And do we actually need to model those two things differently in an empirical sense or not? So that's a second sort of set of questions. Then I started thinking about the explanation. I mean, one of the ways in which, I mean, if you look at the literature on divestments in international business, there's now a large literature which has tried to model divestments in terms of real options theory. So the idea is that you keep an affiliate in a place where you think there might be growth, and you withdraw it. If you close it down, it means you think that growth is not going to materialize anymore. So if you extend this kind of thinking and then people observe different things. So what happens when labor costs go up in a region? What happens when there's a war? A war is very similar to your, the extreme events. And then you have different outcomes. I mean, there's a very large literature now on it. So I just started to wonder about, should this be modeled in a real options framework, really? Is that a better way of approaching it? Because it's a risk. And each risk carries like a different sort of reward. Mitigating the risk might have a reward in some instances, may not have in others. And so does this risk reward perception then affect what multinationals try to do with their subsidiaries? Do they keep them? Do they wait it out? Do they expand their commitments? Do they shrink their commitments, and so on? So there was some. I guess I wasn't sure if the number of affiliates is telling you the right outcome. Should we have like 3 different possibilities, that some risks affect only the divestment, some risks affect only the entry, and some risks affect the expansion of the number of affiliates? It just I just don't know the answer, but I just throw it up in the spirit of discussion. And I think the last thing I was not sure about is something which Nagesh mentioned at the beginning about the pollution haven hypothesis. That to what extent, given that you're looking at FDI worldwide, is there the effect of laws, more stringent laws in one country, hastening the flow of investment to environmentally lax countries? And is that going to cloud some of these empirics that you observe? So, the job of the discussant is to open up more fronts. I really enjoyed the paper. I don't know if I understood all of it, and I will be on a chat with you online about that, the bits that I didn't understand. But I hope this gives us some things to open up for discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suma. I think you have done a good job of raising some questions and on something which is mind-boggling, and it's very natural that when we begin to understand this paper, there will be questions in our mind, and I'm sure Galina will clarify some of them. But let me see if there are other. Yes, I see Dr. Charan Singh raising hand. And I see Dr. Visandas raising hand. So Charan first, then Dr. Visandas. Yes.
Professor Galina, as Professor Nagesh mentioned, it's so apparent, there's so much effort gone in this paper. So thank you for sharing it with us and telling us, because in our country, we have been thinking about these issues now for quite a bit of time. As Professor Suma mentioned, we have crop in one place, and then the burning takes place, and all the smoke comes to the national capital, and we don't know what to do with it. But let me share another example with you in Bangalore. Bangalore is a very upcoming city, and I've been watching Bangalore for nearly 3 decades. There's so much pollution in Bangalore, and the lakes are vanishing. And there is a lake in which smoke happens every year 2 or 3 times. And on the outskirts of that lake, there is so much of pollution and so much industry dumping chemicals in the lake that every now and then there is a foam and then there is smoke. But then it's amazing that every multinational company wants to open an office in Bangalore. And there's no stopping to that. The infrastructure of Bangalore is inadequate. The lakes have vanished, and the climate there is extremely, given this, harsh now, because 30 years back the weather was so pleasant, and then the place lost the forest and the lakes, and therefore the weather has changed. So one thought that I had listening to you was that there could be other factors like profitability that would, and there are countries like India which do not tax climate or pollution, and therefore these companies just chase profits.
You got muted for some reason, Charan.
So these multinationals are chasing profits irrespective of climate conditions in that area. And that is one thing which I wanted to share. And Professor Galina, of late I've been thinking, to some extent, uh, is it lack of, like I come from the financial world and I always think in terms of financial literacy. And I see people getting duped into frauds and scandals because they did not know that they had to be alert to this aspect. And 5 years, or sometimes even within a week, or sometimes 10 years later, they are stuck in a fraud and they don't know. And the seeds of the fraud had been sown much earlier somewhere. So, is it lack with your research? Do you feel there's lack of understanding of climate concerns in the multinationals even today? And that is why nobody is paying heed, neither the companies nor the government. Thank you.
May I come in, Professor Galina, or you will first answer the Charan's issue?
Sorry, please go ahead. Yes, I was muted.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Professor Galina. I enjoyed thoroughly the way you presented, give so many insights into me. Let me said I will consider, because I have worked in the agriculture sector and pharmaceutical sector both. Let me give one example of agriculture. The pollutant does not suffer as much as the person who are uh, sitting miles away, and that happens in agriculture because of burning of the, and in pharmaceutical, when factories are manufacturing something and then all those wastage go down the uh, water bodies, and then everybody fall sick. So this is one. And you mentioned about the policy change, and when you presented the sign and productivity with reference to the policy change, I was not very sure whether you have used that relationship with a lagged reaction, because policy change, say for instance in India, if you make the policy change today, its impact will be seen after few years, at least 2 years down the road. So I don't know whether you are getting some pseudo correlation kind of, or pseudo coefficient of having the policy and having the same impact in the same period. That is question one. And then you tested the hypothesis on more exposed firms are more reactive to climate risk. That is the issue you said, but what was your result based on that, and how, what is the empirical evidence whether more exposed firms are more reactive to the climate risk? And my last point is, now when it comes to the issue of FDI, it is not, it is very important what is happening within the domestic territory of that country, but it also has some repercussion from what is happening in neighboring country. For instance, in COVID period, there were a lot of hue and cry about China, and then people were withdrawing their investment from China to Vietnam and India, and how that environment will fit into this, because your model, to my understanding, was not capturing these factors. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think there are no other hands. So I, just uh, give the floor to Galina to answer some of the questions which have been raised. But I think more you read this paper, more you get, new insights. And I'm sure we would continue to mull over what has been attempted for many weeks, if not
Right.
months. Over to you, Galina.
Thank you so much for comments, especially the discussant. I will definitely think about these issues, especially at the firm level as we're working on a new paper. A couple of things I want to mention. So we have absolutely nothing to say about local pollution, right? So we're just looking at the climate disasters and energy policies, right? And in terms of the discussant's comment on energy policies that tend to be more, they don't happen like an event, like a flood or a fire. In fact, we are looking at the change in policies, and the time series kind of looks similar to the disasters because the changes to policies don't happen very frequently. And another thing that was mentioned in terms of spillovers, we do test to see if the firms move their affiliates from countries with more strict energy policies to the countries with less strict energy policies, right? The carbon leakages that everybody's talking about. We do not find evidence of this in our data. It could be it's just our data is not recent enough, because if you look at the discussion in the European Union, they just adopted the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, because they've noticed that with their emission trading scheme, firms were simply moving the most polluting portions of their production process to other countries. And so they're fighting that by CBAM. And so that is something that is very, very recent, and we just don't have that in our data. So I'm actually planning to rerun all these regressions in 10 years and see if the effects are different. I agree with Charan's interpretation that I think personally my feeling is that what is really going on is most of the firms are essentially in denial, right? The way we're modeling, and that goes to also Discussant's question about the option value and, option modeling, that we do have the present value of future profits as under uncertainty. That's what firms are maximizing. That's why there is an exit threshold. But what I'm thinking about is that if you think of those disasters, the physical events, as IID, you really should not be reacting to them. And I think that's what the firms are thinking about. They think, okay, the flood happened, bad luck, act of God. I'm going to rebuild and continue producing because it is profitable, right? I'm going to stay in Bangalore. But what happens in real life is that the distribution of this event occurrence is shifting to the right. And if you factor that in the firm's decision with full rationality, then you should see those firms exiting, right? Because it's no longer an IID event. And now another flood, to me, should indicate that now future flood probability is gone up, right? And if that's the case, then I should re-optimize, and some firms should exit, right? And that's my concern, is that at some points the firms will realize that their beliefs are inconsistent with what they're observing. The frequency of fires, floods, and hurricanes is inconsistent with the distribution being unchanged. The distribution is shifting. And so once the firms realize that, they're going to factor that in their decision making. And if this happens all at once, we can see quite a rapid adjustment, and that could create risk, especially for small open economies that rely on foreign firms' affiliates for a lot of their jobs and profits and things like that.
Thank you very much, Galina, for taking
Can
up.
I ask something?
Suma, I think you might want to do it bilaterally because it's 9:15 p.m. in Delhi, and I would like to, close in next 1 minute. So, Galina, thank you very much
Professor
for.
Nagesh, Professor Nagesh, sorry
Yes.
intervening. I think there is a question from Mr. Matthew Kurian, and there is a question from Professor Vijay Kumar.
Okay.
I don't know if Professor Rekha also has a question.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions I see on the chat.
Okay, so can we take these questions, and we could go till 9:30 if you are comfortable.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Okay. So over to you, Galina, if you want to take up some of these questions, but I think these are more of the general type, but up to you. I leave it to chat.
So I think in the chat, I totally take all the comments. I think I don't know enough about the Indian economy to speak to any of those comments specifically. I want to learn more. So if anybody has papers on foreign firm location, I do learn a little bit from a student of mine who is just graduating nearby, and Sanyal is moving back to Reserve Bank of India. So please invite him to give a talk. He has a wonderful paper on US-China trade war impact on India's production and imports. I also want to mention to the questions that were asked about pollution and firm location with pollution. A colleague of mine, Kyung Kim, just wrote a paper that is showing that as a result of China accession to WTO, the US essentially moved the polluting portion of its production to China. So this is the topic you want to discuss, that she would be a great presenter to invite. I can put you all in touch. She is an amazing young colleague of mine. But I also want to let Suma ask a question she had.
It was just my thought was that could you do more by way of a spatial econometric analysis to tease out some of the relations between where a disaster was felt and how it affected the nearest FDI versus the furthest. This was what I had in mind to ask. Maybe it's already econometrics heavy, but that could be a nice way to understand whether the results you're getting, could you do a spatial war on them in some way to understand the linkages?
Yeah, we don't really have a spatial matrix for that. Like I can do that in trade, and we are working with the trade linkages and climate shocks paper also. But with FDI, I don't know. I don't have the depth of the data for each affiliate. I know there.
Orbis does list the locations.
I guess you can do that, but it gets very imprecise because when you go to multi-level ownership structure, you get into, it becomes like each firm then has multiple owners, right? Because you can have 20% owned by this firm. And so you can do that, but we don't have enough information on the firm assets. And at that point, you need to aggregate not by the number, but by assets. And if the affiliates do not have separate publicly trading reporting entity, then you don't have any information about them. So you could do it in a smaller scale. I don't think you can do it consistently in a global scale. Yeah, but it's a great idea. I definitely think, we keep working on this, so we will think about if we can do the multi-level ownership. That's a great idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, so is there anyone at this moment wanting to bring another set of issues, or should we thank the speakers and close this discussion and continue to read and mull over the very impressive presentation and analysis that Galina has made? So, yeah, I see Dr. Rekha Jagannath. Yes. Yes, go ahead, please.
I just like to thank Galina for that very interesting study that she has done. However, she showed that in a Pareto that transition impact on productivity is low compared to the physical impact, and that would go a long way, but it needs further sample for distinguishing between the large countries and the small countries. That would be more useful, where physical incidence and impact both on productivity would totally change. And there may not be need for high FDI at all for large countries. However, small countries would need more of FDI. And so the very objective of study changes over there. Maybe it will help your study further if you make this classification. Thank you. That's it. But it was a very interesting study.
Thank you.
To go a long way.
Yes.
We did
Thank
not
you.
make this distinction, so thank you for that suggestion. Definitely worth trying. Yeah.
Yes. Matthew Kurian, do you want to make any point? No. All right. So let me now, sort of close this, very, very interesting seminar organized by EGROW Foundation. And we are very grateful to Dr. Charan Singh for getting such a wonderful seminar organized with such a wonderful presenter in Galina, and what she has presented is really mind-boggling, stimulating, pioneering. All of these adjectives come to mind, and I'm sure that it will continue to inspire a lot of research in the coming years. And this is something of a very hot topic to work on. Climate change is a fact of life, and how it is affecting business decisions is going to be a theme of today and tomorrow and day after. So really, we are grateful to you for sharing your very insightful and very interesting paper, and we will be in touch with you about some follow-ups. And I'm sure we can carry this debate forward for very, very long time. And I want to also thank Suma and all the other participants for joining us and bringing their own insights. So over to you, Dr. Charan Singh.
So I totally agree with you, Professor Nagesh. This was a wonderful session. And as I mentioned to you earlier, you also mentioned the exposure that Professor Galina has, and that the rigor in her research that she brings to the audience is amazing. So I'm really thankful to her. I know she is traveling, and we agreed on this time. It's pretty early up there. She agreed to share this research with us. Same thing, Professor Suma. I must thank you at such a short notice for having agreed to be a discussant and bring the issues that you have. You have certainly raised some very good questions. Even your last question, which you, as a supplement, and reminds me, and I'm still thinking, how does the gravity model fit in your scheme of things in the equations that professor has used in her regressions? I must thank the participants for having raised those issues and questions. And by tomorrow noon, we will have this presentation on our website. You are welcome to look at her paper, which she has shown right in the beginning. And then she has also shared the link to the PowerPoint. You're welcome to have a look at that. And I'm sure we are going to use this presentation and discussion in talking to the policymakers in our country. I must also like to make another announcement. Next week, and Professor Galina, you will like to join. Next week, we are doing a presentation on empowering women. And therein, we are getting two principals, principal of Miranda House, a famous college in India, and principal of Mata Sundari College, another very good college under Delhi University. And then we are getting two people from the industry join us. So we are thinking in terms of empowering women for an advanced India, for making India an advanced country or having India as a developed country by 2047. As you know, the March 31 data, which has just been released 2 days back, India is now a $3.3 trillion economy, which is a substantial jump from where it was a few years back. We are already considered amongst the major economies in the world, and we continue our journey aggressively to become the third largest economy in the world. That's our objective. And what is the role of the women, female labor force participation, and how they can contribute in India's journey towards growth? That is the theme of the talk, and we're going to discuss education. We're going to discuss interaction between industry and education, and then we are going to discuss about the things that are happening in the financial world and things happening in the real sector. So we're bringing in 4 specialized, say, women who will be talking about this. So I would welcome you all. The timing of the session is 4 to 5:30. All the 4 of them are from India. The session is from 4 to 5:30. And if you can join, participate, contribute, it'll be really good for all of us. So once again, let me thank Professor Nagesh for having chaired this session. Again, at a short notice, thanks Nagesh for coming in and helping us out. And you see, you have contributed significantly in the discussion and having identified the discussant and helping us with even the quality of discussion that happened. So I must thank Professor Nagesh for chairing the session. And with that, let me wish you a good night. And Professor Galina, wish you a great day ahead. Thank you.